Good evening and welcome to the Island of Ideas Public Talks series. Tonight I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2024 Phillip Law Lecture titled Australia and the Antarctic Treaty. The talk tonight is hosted by Antarctica Tasmania and the University of Tasmania in honour of the Mawson's Huts Foundation Australian Antarctic Festival, which is running over the current week. My name is Jeffrey McGee, Jeff for short. I'm an Associate Professor here at the University in the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies and also the School of Law. I'm not a scientist, so please don't ask me any science questions. I'm actually an international lawyer and I do most of my work on international law relating to oceans and the Antarctic Treaty System. And I've had the good fortune of working with our speaker tonight, Marcus Haward, over the last decade or so. Before proceeding further, we'll move to the acknowledgement of country. This evening we are broadcasting live from Lutruwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal land, sea and waterways. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania, Antarctic Tasmania and the Antarctic Festival wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Palawa and Muina people. As we gather beneath Kunani, Mount Wellington, as they once did, to discuss the governance of a unique and special land, we reflect on those who came before us and were custodians of this land for thousands of years before, being forcibly removed from this land that was never ceded. We pay our respect to the Palawa elders past, present and emerging and acknowledge their deep history of storytelling, knowledge sharing and caring for the land. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history and continue efforts to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights. So now on behalf of the University of Tasmania, I'd like to express our heartfelt welcome to you all. The Island of Ideas series of talks aims to spark curiosity and foster meaningful conversations in our community in regard to important events and issues. Tonight we delve into the topic that not only holds global significance for those interested in the icy southern continent of Antarctica, but also resonates very deeply within our local community here in Hobart and in Tasmania and also within the university. Of course, Tasmania is one of the 5 Antarctic gateway cities in the world, a fact that shapes both our research strengths here at the university and also our cultural identity here in Hobart and Tasmania. For Tasmanians, the proximity we have to Antarctica is more than geographic. It represents a deep connection to a region that influences our environment, our economy and our future. As a part of this mission, the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania and colleagues over in other parts of the university, such as over here in Arts, Law and Education, lead the way in Antarctic research, bridging local knowledges with global challenges. Our research is driven by a commitment to understanding and preserving the fragile Antarctic ecosystem, which is crucial not only for our island, but for the world. Tonight's talk marks the first year that the University of Tasmania is collaborating with Antarctica Tasmania to deliver the Phillip Law Lecture. And the topic highlights our dedication to advancing understanding and stewardship of the Antarctic region. We honour the work with Antarctica Tasmania to build a legacy of knowledge sharing and to celebrate the contributions of those who have shaped our understanding of Antarctica. I would therefore like to invite Karen Rees, who's the Tasmanian Antarctic advocate, to introduce you all to tonight's speaker and tell you a little about the Phillip Law Lecture. Welcome, Karen.
A very fine good evening, all Antarctic friends and Antarcticans gathered here tonight. The Tasmanian government has sponsored the Phillip Law Lecture since 2002 and has invited noted academic, stateswomen and men, and scientists to give a public lecture on an Antarctic theme. Among them are notable individuals such as Sir Guy Green, and I believe Sir Guy is with us here tonight, Dr. Patricia Selkirk, Dr. Julia Jabbour, Professor Denzel Miller, and Professor Dana Bergstrom, to name but a few. This year, we also wish to thank the University of Tasmania for this collaboration with the Island of Ideas at this great venue. The lecture tonight is named after the Antarctic explorer and physicist, Dr. Phillip Law. Dr. Law was the first director of the Australian Antarctic Division in the then Department of External Affairs, and he was the leader of the Australian National Antarctic Research Expeditions, 1949 to 1966. He founded the Mawson, Davis and Casey stations in Antarctica. Phillip Law made a massive contribution to Australia, both as the first director of the Australian Antarctic Division and as an energetic and groundbreaking expeditioner in his own right. In this tradition, we have invited another individual to present this lecture tonight who has made a massive contribution in his own right, Emeritus Professor Marcus Haward. Marcus Haward is an Emeritus Professor in the Oceans and Cryosphere Centre at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, University of Tasmania, and a program leader in the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre. Marcus is also a member of the Centre for Marine Socioecology here at UTAS and an honorary professor at the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland. He majored in political science and geography, good choice, Marcus, at the University of Tasmania, undertaking an honours degree in urban geography. After a period of teaching on the northwest coast of Tasmania, Marcus returned to UTAS and to the then Department of Political Science and completed his master's and PhD degrees. His research focused on Australian federalism offshore, leading to ongoing work in oceans governance, marine resource management, and Antarctica. He has held visiting or adjunct appointments at the Australian National University, the Australian Maritime College, and the Australian Antarctic Division. He's been a consultant or advisor to state and Australian government agencies and to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Marcus has been a member of Australian delegations to the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources and the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. His research has centred on oceans and Antarctic governance, coastal management, and Australia's regional fisheries interests, and Australians' emerging offshore blue economy. His co-edited book with Tom Griffiths, Australia and the Antarctic Treaty System, UNSW Press 2011, was an award winner in the Australian Educational Publishing Awards of 2012. Marcus has had a long involvement in teaching at undergraduate and postgraduate level in political science and public policy, administration, and marine and Antarctic governance, and supervised higher degree research candidates with over 50 PhDs and research master's completions. Judging by the turnout tonight, I think all of them have come to listen to you tonight, Marcus. I have known and valued Marcus for 35 years, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to ask him to deliver the 2024 Phillip Law Lecture. Please welcome Marcus to the stage.
Thanks, Karen and Jeff, for the introduction, and to Karen for reminding me that it's been a long time between starting my first lecture in this very room and tonight. I'd like to, first of all, reinforce the acknowledgement of country, and in the spirit of reconciliation, I personally wish to respect the elders of the Lutruwita nations past and present, and also wish to acknowledge any First Nations people present tonight. It's a real honour and I was speechless for a moment, which many of you will realise is very difficult, when I was approached earlier this year to give this lecture. And I was asked to consider a topic that was appropriate. And as it's turned out, linking to the Islands of Ideas and the University of Tasmania has provided a particular resonance for the 2024 Phillip Law Lecture, because as we've heard from Karen, Phillip Law, well recognised for his work in establishing the Australian Antarctic Program, as it's now known, ANARI as it was then, and his work in Antarctica and elsewhere. But what's also his contribution after he left the Department of External Affairs was to be a significant figure in the emerging area of higher education and the college system. And so in a sense, it's appropriate that we have this connection at the University of Tasmania. I also wish to recognise the contributions of previous Sir Phillip Law Lecture presenters, and particularly recognise first and foremost Sir Guy Green, our Antarctic ambassador, and staunch supporter of Tasmania's Antarctic interests, who, as you've heard from Karen, delivered the first lecture in 2002, but is here with us tonight. In developing my presentation, and it's a resonance of my whole academic career, I reflect very much on the comment that Sir Isaac Newton made. If I've seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And I've been very blessed for the last 35 or so, 36 years, to be able to work at the University of Tasmania with some amazing colleagues, some fantastic graduate students, and a community in this city and state that really is an island of ideas. The Antarctic Treaty, as everybody here will be aware of, is the basis of an interconnecting system of instruments and decision-making processes. It's provided a framework for governance for over 60 years. Negotiated at the height of the Cold War, the first Cold War, where geopolitical tensions and the minutes to midnight concept first were promulgated. At the same time that heightened national interests occurred, the Antarctic Treaty was a remarkable achievement and has provided a significant base for our contemporary Antarctic governance. That's not to say that the period of time in the 1950s, the tensions weren't real and weren't serious. Science was a major element in providing a way forward and resolving setting aside some of the tensions. But clearly the question of what to do with this area of the globe in the immediate Second World War period was paramount. The Antarctic Treaty's commitments to peaceful use, non-militarisation, science and international cooperation were amazing achievements, and they still continue to this day. These norms and practices that are embedded in the Antarctic Treaty, along with a number of key mechanisms that I'll come to in a short moment, are something that we have to hold very dearly and maintain. Once lost, they'll be hard to recover. In a sense, we've got a governance framework that's neatly encapsulated in the most recent addition to the Antarctic Treaty System instruments. That's the Protocol on Environmental Protections statement that Antarctica is a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And that's a really significant form of words and practice. The protocol's preamble, as many of you would know, also includes a commitment to ensure that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used exclusively for peaceful use or peaceful purposes, and shall not become the scene or object of international discord. My talk tonight, I want to come back to where these norms originated. And in a sense, the subtitle of the lecture, it's not on the slide, but I chose the phrase of close and immediate concern. And a number of you will know that those words are the words of Richard Casey, Minister for External Affairs and significant figure in the development of the Antarctic Treaty. In a publication he authored in 1959 at the conclusion of the Antarctic Treaty. Of close and immediate concern clearly describes Australia's interests in the Antarctic and Southern Ocean, and in a way the driving motivations for our engagement for over a century and a quarter. Now, Richard Casey had a profound influence in the Antarctic Treaty negotiations, but not as many would expect from those words I've just given at the meeting in Washington, although he was influential in there, but in a sense, work he did in Southport, Queensland, where he met with the Soviet ambassador to Australia and worked out a way of engaging with the Soviet Union. Casey recognised that for the Antarctic Treaty to succeed, the USSR needed to be engaged in this at a time when discussion in the United States was divided between Defence and State Department about whether to exclude or include the Soviet Union in the negotiations that were being proposed. Casey recognised the consequences of exclusion of the Soviet Union and clearly argued for their involvement, and it was a persuasive voice. This occurred at a time of heightened tension between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, but also at a time of exceedingly tense relations between, or non-relations between Australia and the Soviet Union in the post-Petrov affair period. And there are interesting interventions that Casey made when the Soviet Union, the Soviet Antarctic expedition, returned from their first wintering over. They wished to visit Adelaide to meet Sir Douglas Mawson. And there was some concern in the media and in the government that what would happen if these communists were let loose in the fair city of Adelaide. And in a sense, of course, Casey cooled heads, and a remarkable meeting occurred. Perhaps helped by the fact, coming back to the character and influences of Phillip Law, was Philip, as many of you would know, Phillip Law had a remarkable resemblance in profile to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And I think that there are some views that helped break the ice, so to speak. Now, the Antarctic Treaty really is a cornerstone of this, but Australia's engagement occurred prior to that and has continued on after it. And the current period of perhaps increased geopolitical tension and heightened national interest causes us to consider what were the forces that were led to the settlement that created the Antarctic Treaty, and can that be applied or reapplied in the 2020s. Now, Richard Casey, of course, was not the first nor the only Australian to recognise the importance of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean to Australia. Douglas Mawson, after enduring the home of the blizzard, argued for ongoing work in Antarctica as much to understand the influence of weather and climate on Australia, connections we are clearly experienced this evening, and the ones that my colleagues at IMAS and at the Australian Antarctic Division are continuing to explore in terms of the impacts of the polar vortex on rainfall and climate in southern Australia. Now, Australian interests in Antarctica predate federation, and it's important to remember that we have this long history, and particularly in Tasmania, from the Clark-Ross and the Dumont-D'Urville expeditions. It's important we don't lose sight of that history. And as my colleagues Tom Griffith, Robert Hall and Marie Kawaja have explored in this pre-federation or early federation period history is important. The heroic era, of course, for Australia was really significantly influenced by Mawson's leading the Australasian Antarctic expedition of 1911-1914. But of course, Mawson also led significant expeditions in the 1929 to 1931 with the two British Australia-New Zealand Antarctic research expeditions, the Banzari expeditions, that basically linked together some of the key themes of my talk, the linking of science with geopolitics. And then, of course, Banzari was important for science and very important activities, but it also led to the secret orders being opened and Mawson proclaiming or making proclamations of territory in the name of King George V for the United Kingdom and then subsequently Australia, and in a sense fulfilling an ambition, at least from the United Kingdom, of painting the Australian quadrant of Antarctica red. It was red in the colour of the atlas, not red of the communist flag. Australia's engagement in Antarctica after the Second World War really was where Phillip Law had a significant role. The establishment of Mawson Station and the participation, importantly, in the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58. And then, of course, that led to Australia's involvement in the Antarctic Conference in Washington in 1958-59. Now, the Washington Conference was a really important event. After the International Geophysical Year was a significant achievement, and a way of addressing the particular problem of Antarctica in the Second World War, post-Second World War period, was resolved from the model that was proposed for the IGY. The Antarctic problem was one of a number of post-Second World War problems, some related to specific issues, or most of them specific issues. The Berlin problem, how to manage a divided city. The Trieste problem about who would occupy Trieste, or where Trieste would be located in the settlement. And of course, the Antarctic problem. The problem there was, of course, territorial claims asserted prior to the Second World War, or just in its early period, led to some overlapping claims made, particularly in the Antarctic Peninsula. And so how to resolve this, along with the interests of the superpowers who hadn't made territorial claims but had significant interests. So in planning for the IGY, the Chilean diplomat and international lawyer Julio Escudero proposed a standstill proposal that, in a sense, was to be that nothing could be done in this period of time that could assert or extend or alter territorial conditions or claims. And in a sense, this standstill proposal was embodied in the language of the time, and I apologise, through the gentleman's agreement that all the parties to the IGY understood. At the end of the IGY, it was clear that there was considerable interest in continuing collaborative work and scientific research in Antarctica. And that led the United States, under President Eisenhower, to invite the other 11 countries that had participated in the IGY to Washington to discuss what an author at the time called International Controls for Antarctica. Eisenhower's letter to the governments emphasised the wish to continue the fruitful scientific cooperation that had occurred under the IGY. And this, in the words of President Eisenhower, the advantage of preventing unnecessary and undesirable political rivalries. Now, the Antarctic Conference held in Washington had 60 preparatory meetings between June 58 and October 59, virtually one a week. The conference proper was from middle of October to the 1st of December, where the Antarctic Treaty was concluded and open for signature. And of course, we still at University of Tasmania, and IMAS particularly, celebrate Antarctica Day, as do a number of other organisations in Hobart on the 1st of December. The Antarctic Treaty is a remarkable achievement. Elegantly brief. I compare it to the Law of the Sea Convention that has 320 articles and something like 400 pages. The Antarctic Treaty is brief and fantastically simple, but covering a range of significant provisions. The fact that the Antarctic Treaty still retains resonance and relevance is due to this elegance. Article 1 demilitarised the continent. Article 4 provided a formalisation of the standstill proposal that Escudero had developed, balancing, very importantly, the interests of claimants like Australia and the non-claimants. Setting aside, but not adjudicating, disputes over territorial claims. And unfortunately, the common terms of freezing territorial claims, it did no such thing. It just set the disputes aside. Any of my students that have got marginal annotations on that phrase, I apologise. Article 7, again, very important provision of an inspection regime that provided the model for a range of activities and included in Australian statecraft in a range of areas into more recent times. For example, Australia's key role in the negotiations of the Chemical Weapons Treaty drew the inspection regime for that instrument from the Antarctic Treaty. Articles 2 and 3 embedded the commitments to scientific investigation and collaboration. And of course, we then had the first meeting of the parties to this new regime, held in Canberra, July 1961, where the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, made the point that it was most appropriate to be discussing matters of Antarctica in a winter period in Canberra. I think it was a cold July, even for Canberra conditions for that. So, in a sense, if we go back to Casey's of close and immediate concern comment, Australia's managed to negotiate key areas of its national interest and get an outcome that it was very important to it, that had, as I'll say in a moment, bipartisan support. Article 4 provided the balancing of just different views about the territorial claims. The non-militarisation objective was a key issue about that Australia was concerned about. And of course, the nuclear-free provision, which I haven't mentioned, the banning of nuclear explosions or storage of nuclear weapons or nuclear waste, was another area that Australia had, as did a number of the Southern Hemisphere parties, great concerns about. So, Australia's interests in the period up to the Antarctic Treaty were accommodated, and we're very fortunate in a sense that we have continued on with using two concepts or two processes that allow our interests to be maintained. I'm interested in the way bipartisanship and bifocalism tie Australia's interests into the Antarctic to contemporary governance. We've had long-standing bipartisan support for Antarctica within Australian governments, and this makes commitments to Antarctic activities relatively straightforward, although there are some flurries around relative funding of science and emphasis and various other things, but let's leave that aside. Now, Australia's interests, key policy interests, have been maintained through this, and that is maintaining Antarctica's freedom from strategic and political confrontation, preserving our sovereignty over the Australian Antarctic Territory, supporting a strong and effective Antarctic Treaty System, the ability to conduct world-class scientific research consistent with our priorities, protecting the Antarctic environment with its special qualities and effects on our region, and that's a clearly significant focus for Australia. And then using the Antarctic to become informed about the region, again, significantly in terms of increasing variability and change in climate, and then the ability to foster economic opportunities consistent with our obligations. Now, these interests for many years were well known within government and the officials working on them, but only in the last decade or so have they become more public, and it's great to see the Australian interest articulated in strategic documents for us as citizens to recognise those, and it's worth acknowledging the fact that those interests can be understood and debated and discussed. Now, these interests are managed by a parallel commitment to bifocalism, and here I mean that Australia maintains its position as a claimant state, and fulfilling the provisions of Article 4, its commitments to the Antarctic Treaty and to the system more broadly, but in a sense does not shy away from the fact that the Australian Antarctic Territory is a territory of Australia. Australian legislation and regulatory instruments and administrative action in Antarctica applies to Australian citizens. And of course, Australia has the right, and has done so in Camelot particularly, to assert stronger measures over Australian activity than is required in the formal conservation measures in Camelot or the measures from the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. Our interests are advanced through emphasis on leadership and influence, our science, our commitment to environmental protection and stewardship, and collaborative activities with a range of partners, both within Australia and outside. Now, switching to the elephant in the room, or the more appropriate metaphor, elephant seal in the room, that is about geopolitics and the Antarctic Treaty System. At times during the past 7 decades, the Antarctic Treaty and system that have developed have faced significant external challenges. And at the same time, internal discussion and debate within the system have also seen some pressure points emerge. Broad-based support for the Antarctic Treaty values of peace, science and cooperation have been maintained, but as Andrew Jackson and I have written recently, the robustness and resilience of the system is somewhat unrecognised, and I think we need to accept that at times, just as we will disagree, the Antarctic Treaty parties will often have disagreements, and tensions may arise. The important thing is how to constructively engage to see that as a way forward rather than as a sort of an implosion. It's arguable that resilience and adaptability of the Antarctic Treaty System have been undervalued in contemporary academic framings of the Antarctic geopolitics, that in a sense have tended to highlight emergent tensions and an apparent lack of responsiveness on the system, and in a sense saying, well, we need to look at new or reforming, rebuilding or overturning the Antarctic Treaty. Despite a range of challenges, the system has been remarkably resilient, fitting a common definition of resilience, that is, the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganise while undergoing change, so as to still essentially retain the same function, structure and feedback and identity, but moving forward. And I think that can apply very clearly to the Antarctic Treaty System over the past 40 or so years. If we look at a survey of external challenges and internal issues, I think this argument about resilience can be made more clearly. A key point, though, is what can this tell us about the ability of the system and the treaty to address current geopolitical stressors? And if we look at some of the external challenges, the conflict between the United Kingdom and Argentina, which predated the Antarctic Treaty signing, and of course, unfortunately included the Falklands War in 1982, could have been a debilitating and difficult issue for the system. The interesting thing, of course, was that the Falklands War was conducted outside the Antarctic Treaty area, and in a sense the conflict fell between what were then biennial Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings. So it's a slightly different condition to the current conflict between members. Another external tension was South Africa's participation in the Antarctic Treaty System during the apartheid period. And this was raised by another external, one significant factor of the period between 1982 and 2004, and that was the question of Antarctica, raised by Malaysia, concerned that the Antarctic was not responsive to concerns of the outside the system, if you like, and in a sense needed to recognise emerging concepts like taken from the Law of the Sea Convention, which had been negotiated in the mid-1970s to early 1982, the common heritage of mankind. And Malaysia's argument, in a nutshell, was that the Antarctica should be properly administered under the United Nations system. Australia played an important role in responding to Malaysia's initial debate and the question of Antarctica. Richard Walcott, the then permanent representative, and a distinguished diplomat and Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, was a key person in this debate. And in a way, again, Australia benefited from significant leadership. Ambassador Walcott had the advantage of being a former High Commissioner to Malaysia, a former ambassador to Moscow, and an ambassador to Ghana. So in a sense, it was able to bring together a coalition of groups together to respond to the question of Antarctica. It was interesting, though, of course, that the agreement was that Australia would lead the response to this debate at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And of course, Ambassador Walcott said to me, he said, I sat down and expected another treaty party to stand up, but no one did. And afterwards he said, what happened? He said, oh, Your Excellency, you spoke so well, we didn't need to say anything more. But importantly, Australia was able to keep the then Soviet Union inside the tent under enormous pressure from the frontline states in Africa over the apartheid issue. It's an area that, or a topic that's not well known, and it's one where Ambassador Woolcott and his staff did a remarkable job in keeping the system together. The law of the sea that I've just mentioned also surfaces in an external challenge to the Antarctic at a more contemporary time in relation to states like Australia and other Antarctic states declaring extended continental shelves and what to do with their sub-Antarctic and then Antarctic continental shelves. In a sense, the relationship between the Law of the Sea Convention and the Antarctic Treaty is an interesting one. The Law of the Sea was developing about the same time as the Antarctic Treaty was being negotiated, with the first of the conventions, the Geneva Convention on the Law of the Sea, being concluded in 1958. The way in which Australia's response to this, and we have in the audience key players in this strategy, was to make sure that Australia wasn't disadvantaged by its future options or cut off future options. So the science was done to look at the question of the continental shelf off Antarctica as it was in the sub-Antarctic islands and around the continental mass of Australia. But then the decision was made to request that the United Nations body adjudicating or assessing this, the Commission for the Limits of the Continental Shelf, was not to look at this, so just set aside this information. That model was taken up by other parties. Again, an active way Australia has resolved tensions and kept the system going, but while maintaining its national interest in a very important set of alternative legal regime. We have a new instrument, what we can call the BBNJ Treaty, more properly, an agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation of sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is why all the diplomats call it the BBNJ Agreement. BBNJ Agreement was adopted last year, 19th of June 2023. It's a global instrument, but it also has significance in terms of the Southern Ocean in relation to how Kamilar, it engages the Kamilar. The BBNJ agreement is yet to enter force, but there's a head of steam behind it. Australia is actually right at the moment preparing its internal mechanisms to ratify. The agreement has a very important provision of not to undermine existing arrangements or organisations. So in a sense, Kamilar will remain a significant arrangement and organisation for the Southern Ocean. But what we now have is an alternative instrument that will be looking at high seas management and governance. And so in a sense, it will learn from Kamilar and the Madrid Protocol through a number, it's already through mechanisms such as environmental impact assessment, but it will also provide shed a light on the performance of these instruments. And I think that's something that we need to be well aware of. We have the rights of nature critique that's emerging with a declaration on alternative formulation for the Antarctic, a very interesting challenge. This critique has little traction within the ATS system, but it's clearly important in building in civil society and the reframing of Antarctic governance that it's argued there needs to be taken into account and responded to. Of course, climate change is particularly significant. A range of biophysical, regional and global impacts, increased variability and change in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, how the system responds to that is going to be important. And this has governance challenges that we've already seen. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a troubling event in many senses, but has a number of potential consequences for the Antarctic system. The last, up until 2024, it was clear that Russia's objection to the raising of these matters in the Antarctic Treaty was supported by a number of countries, particularly in the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa coalition. And it appears that this was sort of tacit, if not overt support for Russia. The most recent Antarctic Treaty Consulting meeting in Kochi in India seems to mean that closeness between the BRICS is perhaps not as solid as it might appear. But again, a consequence of an alternative political grouping within the system and what that will mean for building consensus or maintaining consensus is really important. Now, in terms of internal aspects and challenges, the Russian-Ukraine conflict shows external influences do impact on the Antarctic system. But of course, we've also seen that in the past. And the most significant, of course, again, had an Australian flavour and importance. And that's the setting aside of the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities, CRAMRA, and the development of the Protocol on Environmental Protection. Australia played a key role in this, as you all know. And what's really interesting in a sense was my first connection to Phillip Law was at a conference that Richard Herr organised in 1989 that was published in a book on Australia's future, continuing to change, at this time when we weren't sure what was happening. Phillip Law gave a presentation, unfortunately not in person, he couldn't travel, that was basically fairly critical, if I may say so, of the environmental agenda at the time because of his concern about the way the system could break down. I personally was challenged at this conference by none other than John Heap, who was the very doyen and leader of the British Antarctic delegation and a key figure in Antarctic matters, as saying it was my generation's fault. I was much younger than I am now. It was my generation's fault that if the Antarctic Treaty was destroyed. This was going into a dinner that we put on in CSIRO that had the most amazing grouping of there. We had the Prime Minister Hawke speaking to Jacques Cousteau. Yes, it was a logistical and administrative nightmare, but it was a very interesting discussion. And of course, again, the debate at that time was about how to continue. The continuity was as important as the change. One of the lessons that comes from Australia's activity in the development of the environmental protocol was the importance to consensus making. And despite the political costs that Australia wore, and we did wear them, the commitment to building consensus is really important. And I really encourage you to read Andrew Jackson's brilliant study on this in his book, Who Saved Antarctica? The Heroic Era of Antarctic Diplomacy. And of course, the importance was not just saying, well, we don't believe in mining in Antarctica, but what would replace it? And in a sense, how do we actually get something that brings people together? While a protocol on environmental protection is a high point, and Australia can be justly proud of its involvement in that, there are some missing aspects of that regime, and we still have not progressed the liability regime. And that's, again, indicates to me that the system itself internally lets us open to criticism, that it can't actually fulfil the design that was promised in the early 1990s. We still face challenges in CAMLR. The CAMLR Convention's objectives about conservation of marine living resources is clear. This objective does, as many of you will know, includes the recognition of rational use. But this is subject to the overarching conservation objective. This interpretation is under challenge from an argument of balancing rational use and conservation. Further challenges in CAMLR are about debates about the element at the core of CAMLR, that is, that decisions are made on the basis of best available science. And while the norms and definitions of best available science are clear, they are being challenged. And we see a range of challenges in of blocking of consensus in area protection and marine protected areas. So what are the current stresses or indicators of stress within the ATS, the Antarctic Treaty System? I think very simply it's a hardening of positions. Key agenda items within the ATCM and CUP and CAMLR, positions are being hardened. There's Russian statements and work that we should be careful not to pass too much into them, but about challenging the prohibition of mining under the protocol. The challenges in consensus making, or more importantly, the apparent lack of commitment to building consensus, as Lynn Goldsworthy has shown in significant and detailed analysis, is really important and another concern. It's another indicator. Just the fact that there are challenges in gaining agreement over the final reports in meetings is an indicator of difficulties. The breakdown in the work of CAMLR and its scientific committee, stalemates in progressing area protection, the legalisation of science also indicate that there are stresses there. Perhaps a loss of trust and engagement and the increasing impact of external geopolitical issues. And of course, leading to perhaps a decline in what we could call Antarctic exceptionalism. The fact that Antarctica, in many of the examples that I've talked about from the past, was able to be quarantined from the other issues from outside. Are we seeing the end of Antarctic exceptionalism? So, to conclude, what should Australia do? In a way, coming back to my a Leninist phrase, what is to be done? In summary then, Australia is an original signatory to the treaty, a depository state for CAMLR, prime influence on the development of the environmental protocol, and it's maintained its commitment to the system and influence within it. We need to make sure that we align our national interests and activities with the ATS objectives. We must make sure we do that. We need to work with other states, including obviously our like-mindeds, but also new entrants or countries interested in the Antarctic Treaty. Building and strengthening support for the key norms and values, but also the centrality of the treaty inspection regime. We need to be constant in our defence of the Antarctic Treaty System, its rules, norms and principles. We need to be prepared to call out, but to do this in a measured way, actions that are not aligned with these rules, norms and principles. As I said, some of these activities can have some costs. Interestingly, the then Minister of the Environment got more letters complaining about the removal of dogs from Antarctica, the Australian dog teams, than they did on the successful completion of the Madrid Protocol and the banning of mining. So some costs and things can be worn in different ways. We must be prepared to lead on issues that are stalemated, but always working to build consensus and looking at alternative and ways to do it, in a way recognising that there may well be opportunities to gain agreement that are not immediately or obviously apparent. We've seen recent debates on the need to maintain Australia's Antarctic science program and its linked necessary logistical support. Science remains, as the late Pat Quilty often would say, the currency of credibility, and there's no doubt about that. Cooperation in scientific research enhances our engagement with other parties, and so we need to maintain our scientific program. But we also need to resource the necessary diplomatic and administrative support to the system to assure that this area of close and immediate concern, in the words of the Madrid Protocol, shall continue forever to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene of or object of international discord. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for a very stimulating discussion of the Antarctic Treaty System. We'll now retire to these red chairs over here, Marcus, and we'll take some questions both online and from the audience in the room. Okay, so there's a question about, I guess, compliance issues with the Antarctic Treaty. It's from Edward. He says, are all states that are members to the Antarctic Treaty respecting the Antarctic Treaty, and are they breaching the Antarctic Treaty, and if so, are there penalties for such a breach?
I think that we've got to be careful about what's seen as flurries or sort of issues and things. Yes, the answer is that generally speaking, the parties do maintain commitment and compliance with the Antarctic Treaty. If we look at the key objectives, the Antarctic is demilitarised. There's no nuclear thing there, and the compliance measures are there. If there are mechanisms to address those, but we fortunately haven't needed them. The inspection regimes are important and are in fact an educational activity as much as anything else. So I think that the discussions are around interpretations and potentially how long this will be if, for example, a party decided that it was going to stretch the scientific work on mineral or geological research to the point of pre-prospectivity. That might be an area of concern.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. I see there's a hand up firstly here at the front.
Marcus, I wondered if you wanted to say just a little bit more about the up-and-coming potential for review of the system in 2048 and what you think the risks might be there, if any.
Thanks, Cherie. Yes, it's an interesting... 2048 has become a mythological year in a way for the Antarctic Treaty. This is the Madrid Protocol has a provision for a review in 2048, 50 years after it entered into force. It's a provision for review. It doesn't mean it will necessarily happen, but I think Australia and other parties should be considering what would happen with this. The concern would be that if this is not, this review could open up a range of areas of concern, and in a sense, I talked about the diminution of norms by nibbling away at them. This could well be a case where the system is attacked by a fairly innocuous sense of a review that starts to open up areas that might be there. A bit like snagging a jumper on a fence and suddenly you don't realise that you've got a rent through it and then the jumper falls apart. This could be the way that it could go. I think that there will be significant discussions in the lead up to 2048, and I think that it could be a very positive opportunity, but it could also, I think, could raise some concerns if we're not aware of the potential for disruption in a negative sense.
Okay, thanks Marcus. Thanks, Cherie. Look, there's a question here online, Marcus. I think it's directed towards the issue of third-party states, that is, states that may not be in the Antarctic Treaty. And the question is as follows. It says, the treaty is not signed by all nations operating in Antarctica. What happens if a nation that has not signed the treaty flouts one of the articles of the treaty?
Well, basically that would be a case of taking action in a range of areas, and in a sense you've got mechanisms that allow us to do that in the dispute resolution mechanism, but in a way the activities in a sense of third parties, and in a way that my more concern is not about states but about non-state actors, in a sense of some of the more influential businesses that decide to find a genetic, sort of bioprospecting and things. How do we manage that? But I think we need to actively engage and be aware of any of these developments, and parties that have got significant clout should work with them in a bilateral way, these interests, and address them, and then if necessary use the fallbacks that are available for sanctions. Yeah,
thanks, Marcus. And I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that the states that are on the continent itself are all parties to the treaty.
Yes, that's right.
It might only be sort of flag states and some
that's
tourist
right.
ships and whatnot.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Okay. There was one down here in the middle. Okay, thank you.
I'm wanting to a little bit elaborate on how the inspection regime is meant to work, or how it's understood to work, and a little bit about the practicalities of how it works. Thank you.
Okay, there are many people in the audience, or a number of people in the audience who are more expert on these provisions and have had to deal with them there. But in a sense, the inspection regime, based on the principle of the Russian proverb that Ronald Reagan used in his meetings with Gorbachev, which is trust but verify. The idea that you can inspect anywhere, anytime, but of course in the Antarctic logistical realm, it's not, notice has to be given simply to do this. But my experience, I was fortunate to be on the delegation to an Antarctic Treaty meeting where I was assigned to the legal and administrative working group to keep me out of mischief and things, and support this, Michael Stoddart at the time, Professor Michael Stoddart, who was Australian rep on that committee. But that was the one, for most of this week, or 4 days of this meeting, the room was just a handful of the delegates that were there. But Michael said, it'll fill up this afternoon, and it was when the inspection reports were presented. And in a sense, the inspection report, even then, many years ago, were important, will recognise what was being done, what was being said. So in a way, the inspection regime is not to catch out the guilty, but to in fact inform and educate. And in a sense, the inspection regime in the Antarctic needs to be updated. We need to be able to use modern technology. We need to be able to do that. There's some discussion and debate, and people more expert on that can correct me. But I think that the challenge will be to ensure that the inspection regime is able to move into this current era where a lot of remote activities are being done, and in a sense, we need to be able to use aerial and satellite and other things that we've seen in Kamilar, where there is aerial observation of illegal fishing. It's not inspection, but that couldn't be acted upon because it wasn't seen to be within the by one party didn't believe that was appropriate data to present. So there are some challenges, but in a sense, I think if we try to negotiate an inspection regime now, it'll be a very different and more challenging thing now. We're lucky we've got the framework there.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Look, we've got about 5 minutes left, so let's try and squeeze in a couple of more questions. There's one online here from Gillian, who we both know up in Sydney, I think, and his question is about the outer space regime. He says the regime in outer space is developing. Do you think there are Do you think there are any interesting ideas in the debate in the space regime that might be relevant to the future of the Antarctic Treaty?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that that these areas, common spaces and things that are into space are all grappling with the same question about state action and things. So I think that the challenge of verification of actually compliance are all what we've learnt in the Antarctic system for over 7 decades, I think could be applied into the space regime. And I think what we learn from the Antarctic is having an inspection system that is respected, perhaps could be a lot more effort put into it, but by all parties, does provide this basis of trust. And I said that one of my concerns is this loss of trust and engagement. And I think that having the inspection regime and the added dimension of the inspections that include parts of the Monetary Protocol provide practical opportunities for both the countries in doing the inspections and the hosts to engage and discuss. And that's, I think we could apply that to outer space.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Look, we've probably got time for one more, so just down the front here.
Thank you. From an environmental perspective, countries like Japan, Iceland have continued unveiling in the cryosphere. Captain Paul Watson, someone who's tried to protect the Southern Ocean, potentially be extradited to Japan. Overkilling is a major problem. And so how effective and enforceable are international laws and treaties in this space when these actions continue?
Well, it's important in a sense to separate the Antarctic Treaty regime from other activities, and in a sense the whaling regime is a very different one. It's explicitly separated from the Antarctic. The question of overlap of instruments and institutions is indicated with emerging developments in, say, the BB&J area, a concern. What the challenge is to make sure that we don't end up with a sort of forum shopping activity in the Southern Ocean where alternative regimes, countries pick the instrument that they wish to apply and then use that to undermine activities in another one. I can't comment on the case that you're mentioning. I don't know enough about it and the basis on which the actions are being taken, so I can't comment on it.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Look, sadly, we've run out of time for further questions. So could everyone put their hands together and thank Marcus? And if anyone's got any burning desire to learn more about what Marcus talked about tonight, we have wonderful programs at IMAS on marine and Antarctic studies and Antarctic governance for those who might be interested. But anyway, thank you all here for being such an attentive audience. Much appreciated. The questions are fantastic. I hope you really enjoyed the lecture. On behalf of the University of Tasmania, have a happy and safe evening and good night.